and welcome to another episode of Football Today. I am joined, as I always am, by David Goss. David, are you excited to talk about the Jack Grealish and Harry Kane pursuit?
Interesting. I thought you were going to want to go deep on the Egyptian Olympic men's soccer team. So that's what I had prepared for in all of this?
Next week's.
We're going to do a post-mortem 3 weeks after they get eliminated.
Exactly. It's what the fans want, Dave. So, good to speak as always. No, actually, this week we're going to be talking about something actually much further in the future, about 9 years in the future, the 2030 World Cup. And where will it be? So why are we talking about an event that's going to take place in about 9 years? Well, we just had the Euros, obviously. We're in the middle of the Olympics, which is one of those other events that happens once every 4 years. And that, I love. And a few weeks ago, Matt Slater of The Athletic, reported Italy exploring a bid with Saudi Arabia. So there's a little bit kind of recent news. And honestly, I'm not really ready to talk about transfers yet. I mean, we're still in the thick of it, and it feels like kind of what's the point? So that's why I want to talk about it. Are you excited to talk about the 2030 World Cup, Dave?
I actually am. We'll have an interesting nugget in this coming up, but I have been a supporter of one of these bids for a very long time. So I've been thinking about this for probably way longer than anyone should.
We have another nugget in here that's going to say that you were not the first one thinking about the 2030 World Cup, because there's a dude who was thinking about it in 1997. So, but that's for a little bit later. At the moment, I kind of want to talk about, just because I think a lot of people don't really know how World Cups necessarily get voted on, or how, kind of breaks down or works out. So, Dave, if you could just give like a very brief overview on how the last few World Cups have been voted on.
Yeah, so obviously they occur at a FIFA Congress. And so for the last full FIFA Congress, it was voted on by all 211 members of FIFA. So every single federation that's official got a vote. Obviously, previous to that, as many people will know from the Russia and Qatar winning the bids in theirs, that they were voted on by the FIFA council members, which at the time was a 24-person council. Now it's 37, because democracy throughout FIFA now and fairness across all things, adding 13 members. But all you needed to do was win a majority of those votes. And I think we don't even have to go into explaining what it seems like happened with each of those votes throughout the England versus Russia bids, and then the US versus Qatar bids for 2022. As it comes up, one of the things that is somewhat timely is that most likely, it feels like in the second quarter of 2022, that's when FIFA is going to set the parameters for voting as well as for the bids for this World Cup. And then the 74th FIFA Congress in 2024 is when it's expected to be chosen who will be the host of the 2030 World Cup.
So our, analysis today, you can pour over for the next 3 years until they make this decision. So, gist of it, countries from being considered, as we'll get to with Saudi Arabia and potentially China. And, that's one of the other, the big things that they've mentioned so far, kind of in the lead up to this. And then, of course, the venue requirements. And they're also supposed to be making this whole process a bit more transparent than in years past, where there was a lot of cloak and dagger. And this is hopefully going to make for a better process. There's also some other changes in regards to years past. There's been an emphasis now on, human rights, which, believe it or not, wasn't included in the previous years. And this is something that Gianni Infantino has specifically mentioned, although that won't stop. There's, significant venue requirements anytime you host this tournament for the 2026 World Cup, just as an example, because we're going to talk about these things. So it's important to kind of have an understanding of them. Each group game needs to be able to hold 40,000 spectators, 50,000 for a quarterfinal, 60,000 for the semis, and at least 80,000 for the opening match and the final. And that's obviously quite difficult for a lot of countries to find, stadiums that will host 80,000 for opening match and a final, to say nothing of 60,000 for the semis. So um, those are some important things to kind of be aware of. And, you know, there are also some obviously other really, really important things that the that FIFA kind of considers when they're accepting these big bids and evaluating them. And you know, they put out a 224-page document with the U.S. and Morocco bid for the 2022 World Cup, which had a lot of kind of interesting nuggets in there about what they're looking for. So, Dave, what are some of the things that they're looking for besides, you know, human rights and venue sizes?
So one of the keys for Morocco that worked against them in the 2026 World Cup bidding was hotel accommodations, so ability to accommodate people coming into the country to stay around the venues, and then transportation in and around the venues, and especially to get into the cities, but also between the cities. So those are some of the huge things that FIFA looks for in terms of your ability to successfully host a World Cup. There's a lot of conversation as well as research that they do around potential revenue. And that is probably the biggest thing, but they don't say that out loud, although they do publish a lot of the numbers. So it's revenue on tickets, but then it's also potential commercial revenue because of local companies, as well as other events that you can do around a World Cup. And then they have to always focus on time zones as well, because this is a world stage event. And so you're looking at your major markets around the world and who's going to be able to really focus on them. And so those are a lot of the parts that you look at. They do a full breakdown of each of the countries, or as we're about to get into, co-host countries, bids, and it goes through everything, potential fan fest sites. They grade the usefulness or the helpfulness of the local governments, as well as the national governments. And there's a lot then around safety, security, health, and now you have one line that says sustainability, human rights, and environmental protection. And those, from what I've seen on the United North American bid as well as Morocco, all came out low. So I don't know that that's a category that anyone's really going to win in based off the way these tournaments work. But those are the main considerations that FIFA goes through. They put together reports. They do multiple site visits in those countries. They have consulting companies that they use as well as internal people, different FA presidents that are part of these trips as well. And they pretty much just go around, they judge them, they put together a score out of 5, and then they add for each of the categories, and then they add all those up and they put together an overall bid score for each of the bids.
Yeah, and the Russian judge is always particularly harsh and difficult.
Doesn't like the form of that transportation.
Yeah, the environmental protection. I'm sure they're going to have a lot of FIFA inspectors going into, you know, Chinese coal factories and coal mines, trying to determine how healthy they are. It sounds like someone's at my door. Maybe it's the FIFA inspectors for the 2030 bid. Yeah, so it looks very thorough, and I'm not saying that it isn't very thorough, but like, you know, they put in the, you know, kind of commercial aspects right next to some of these as if they're kind of on equal footing. I mean, when you look at that document, right, Dave, it's like they put it all together as if they're equal weight for these things. But as we know from the USA bid, the amount in commercial appeal is quite drastic between bids. Like, do you remember what it was between the U.S. and Morocco in the 2026 World Cup between those bids?
So this is what FIFA put down as their overall forecast revenues. They put down 7.2 billion US dollars for Morocco 2026, and for the United North American bid, they put down 14.3 billion US dollars. So almost double what they assumed the Morocco bid would make. And that obviously doesn't include, we should say, I think television rights in most of the countries, because those are probably going to be even. So that's what they think can shift between game revenue, commercial rights because of where you're hosting it, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So like pretty big, you know, differentiations right there.
And I just wanted to add in, they believe the difference for ticketing between Morocco and the United North American bid would be $1.8 billion itself, which seems to be pretty massive.
Yeah. And just actually, like, interestingly enough, that US figure just for hospitality sales would be 150% above what it was in Russia. So like this stuff matters, and it's just like it is interesting when you like, oh yeah, like you know how much do they weigh that versus other things like accommodation and transport, which we'll get to the a little bit. But it's important to talk about these things before we look at some of these bids. So if we look at some of these expected bids for the 2030 World Cup, we already have ones that have been kind of confirmed as bids that are going to happen, and then some that are kind of rumored or likely to happen. And we'll go through those right now. So as for kind of confirmed bids, we have Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. One that I know, Dave, you're going to be quite bullish on when we break down. Portugal and Spain. That's another confirmed bid. Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, Serbia. I mean, definitely the the long shots in this. Morocco is going to be at play, although we'll see with Morocco who they're potentially with. Is it with Spain and Portugal? Is it with Egypt? Is it with Saudi Arabia? And who they could be with a number of different people. And then we have the home nations: England, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And as we said before, the one with Saudi Arabia potentially and Italy, those two common bedfellows getting together one last time to save the world of the World Cup. And then as a dark horse, there are rumors, although it looks like they might be looking for 2034, China. So those are that's the field, if you will. Who knows? Someone else might get involved, but those are kind of the 7 likely bids. Off the top, Dave, what do you think of that group?
So I think it's interesting that it felt like everyone knew what the rotation would be, and now you look at a group of bids that come from almost every continent. It's interesting that the countries believe that it's available sort of to everyone after what has been a fairly clean rotation system going into this of rotating which continent, which federation gets to host. And then I think you look at some really interesting co-hosting. I think we're at a place where no country should really host one of these competitions by themselves because, one, it's unnecessary, and two, it just seems to be the financial strain of putting it together is too much for most individual countries. And so co-hosts seem to make sense, and a lot of these are logical. Portugal, Spain, obviously sharing a border, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Paraguay, all countries that share borders that make sense in the same region. And then you've got some interesting ones where it seems unlikely, but I think one of the things, and I'm currently watching the Olympics as we talk about this, is as you get to the nuts and bolts of these things, it seems less sustainable, and there's not a ton of popular support for hosting a lot of these competitions. Hence why you see Kazakhstan get very close to hosting a Winter Olympics, and Brisbane, it seems like most likely hosting a Summer Olympics because other areas aren't going to bid, and that's why a Morocco or an Egypt feels like they have an opportunity, even without maybe the modern infrastructure to some extent to host these things, because they could be the only bid left by the time you get to the vote.
But Dave, why would these countries want to miss out on a once in a lifetime opportunity for all of these dollars, all this economic activity? Why would they want to do such a thing?
$14.2 billion.
No, well, that's for FIFA. But why would a country want to miss out on these glorious opportunities?
So it looks like right now we're in a situation where most of what's put together is paid for by the countries, and most of it feels like over the last cycles of Olympics and World Cups has little sustainability for the actual countries. And so it's a money pit. There's a ton of requirements that FIFA continues to push, which a lot of countries can't reach or don't have the potential to reach, but they continue to try to anyway. And a lot of the fixes are short term of putting together a bus system just for 3 games and not rebuilding a transportation system in a city that should actually work going forward, building stadiums that cities don't need. And as we've seen photos of from a lot of different areas, including Athens, Greece, which is one of the bids in here, as well as Brazil at the last World Cup. Mostly, a lot of these stadiums are not being used anymore. So there's one or two reasons that this doesn't make sense for a lot of countries. What it seems like has been the big push is emerging, what they believe are emerging countries, trying to use it as a way to sports wash themselves or prove themselves to the rest of the world. And that's kind of been the sweet spot for the IOC as well as FIFA and these other international organizations over the last few years. And the question is if there's more of those countries willing to do this, or do you just start going back to China every 2 years?
Yeah, it's a soft power play for a lot of countries, and we'll get to that with maybe Saudi Arabia in a minute. And you mentioned sports washing. Let's get into some of these countries. Uh, and actually, before we very quickly before we do, traditionally, as it should be mentioned that like this is normally rotated, but when Gianni Infantino is asked, like, are you going to accept all bids? He said, as FIFA president, the message to the entire world is come and bid. The more we have, the merrier. So he is accepting, any host from Asia, and that would typically not be okay because Asia is hosting the Qatar one in 22, and they don't
But
normally host the last, from the two previous World Cups.
but as we're saying, there is less drive for countries to host.
Yeah.
So now FIFA is in bidding wars against countries, and they are trying to get as much as they can in terms of guaranteed spending, in terms of FIFA's ability to make requests, FIFA's ability to have direct communication with the government. So if FIFA says, this is Africa's World Cup, someone in Africa come bid, well, now Morocco has a ton of leverage. And I think that's part of what FIFA is doing, is trying to find leverage again against a lot of these countries to get more demands.
Yeah, well put. I agree. So let's get into probably your favorite bid, the Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Paraguay bid, also known as the Southern Cone 2030 World Cup, which, as a huge ice cream fan, I'm excited by that name. I can already imagine the logos and designs you could go with that. Dave, do you want to hear about a man named Abel Fialco?
Sure.
Well, this man, Abel Fialco, is the reason you can, believe that the Southern Cone might get this World Cup. He was a Uruguayan who lived in, or maybe still lives in, Israel. And this whole story starts because Athens, which was being rumored and was bidding for the 1996 Olympics, they were considered kind of the natural choice because of the 100th anniversary of the Olympics in 1996. And after they didn't get it, and it went to Atlanta, Abel Fialco thought that, okay, we need to do the same thing, but with Uruguay, because of, quote, historical rights. Uruguay hosted the 1930 World Cup, which was the inaugural World Cup. And, as we know, we're talking about the 2030 World Cup, 100 years later. And so in 1997, man, this guy was quick. Next year, after the Summer Olympics, he sets up a website, which, let's be honest, in like 1997, setting up a website was like not as easy as it is now, going on like
Huge
GoDaddy.
tech knowledge.
Yeah, man, he was about it. And so he started this website and started his promotion rally, his promotion drive to get Uruguay to get the 2030 World Cup. Now, as we know, Uruguay is not a sexy place to host a World Cup in 2030, by itself at least. But this like picked up steam in 2005. Uruguayan President Tabare Vasquez met with then FIFA President Sepp Blatter, and mentioned that they should do this to commemorate, the centenary in 1930. And then, Blatter said some, positive words. Fast forward, there's some more positive feelers after that, and finally, the kind of initial intention to bid was made public by who else but Luis Suarez and Lionel Messi. And that was in 2017 in a game between each other. They wore jerseys depicting the year 2030. And I mean, I can't think of two better ambassadors for the World Cup there than Luis Suarez and Messi, even though none of them will be playing. Although you never know with Messi, he's, eternal.
So I said this at the beginning of the show. I support one of these bids. This is my bid. And yeah, I was not on this as early as Abel. Congrats to him and shout out for being a visionary. I really hope he makes it, by the way. I don't know his age, but he started this in 96. That's, 34 years away. So I really hope he's still kicking and ready to travel and be there for this 2030 World Cup. I heard about this, I want to say like around 06, probably. I have a bunch of books about the World Cup, the history of the World Cup. It's my favorite thing that happens. So I've read a ton about it. I've watched videos of ones I wasn't watching or wasn't at. I've traveled now to 3 World Cups myself, 4 if you include the Youth World Cup, which I don't think many people would. No. So I love the World Cup. And to me, this was such an exciting idea of 100 years after Uruguay hosted the first ever World Cup, to be able to bring it back and then to co-host it with Argentina actually has a decent amount of romanticism and history. And while they're massive rivals, a large part of the international game growing was that rivalry. And so when you look at early days of the international football scene, it is Argentina versus Uruguay, Argentina versus Uruguay. That's where the name the Olympico comes from. When you score an Olympico from a corner, it's because Uruguay was the Olympic champions, which was massive, and an Argentine player scored it against them. And so that's where that term comes from. And a ton of the game, the growth of the game, the best players, the best teams early on, all come from that region. So I like the idea of that romanticism of having it 100 years later. The Uruguay, obviously, stadium that hosts all their national team games is the Estadio Centenario, which was built for the 1930 World Cup because it was the 100-year anniversary of the country of Uruguay. So now you get the double up on the Centenario term. Whoa. 100 years later. And you want to talk about sustainability, it is still their national stadium. There still is a ton of value. And so when I look at a World Cup, in my ideal dream world, and this will never happen, FIFA will actually put money in to help the countries build the infrastructure, and then that can be a lasting impact for the region. This is a region in which they will use all these stadiums. Because if you could do it across 4 countries, and you can build a few in Paraguay, some in Chile, and then Argentina and Uruguay, you're not overloading one area with a bunch of high-tech, 60,000 person stadiums they don't need. And you're probably building enough for all of those teams and all of those regions to then use them going forward. So I love the idea of all of this. I've already researched charter boats that I could live in the River Plate and just sail between Uruguay and Argentina. I've told everyone about it. If anyone else steals that idea, please don't price me out because I don't have a ton of money.
Or just book us spots. Just reserve some spots on the boat.
Yeah. If you want to book one, just 2 for us. We don't need to bring anyone else.
We have limited supplies that we need. But I think those are all really good points. And I think like Argentina, I was counting, they had something like 10 or 11, stadiums already that are above 40,000. This is an area, it might even be more than that. There's like already a ton of stadiums in all these countries for the most part that are already built. That doesn't mean that they won't need to be retrofitted to comply with FIFA regulations and, hospitality boxes and venues and whatnot. But they already have these stadiums, and not only that like these are not going to be empty stadiums after. As anyone who follows Argentinian football knows, people be going to these games. Like, this is not some like 60,000 person stadium in the middle of the Amazonian forest. Like,
Whoa, don't disrespect Manaus, man. That was one of the best viewing experiences I've ever had at a World Cup. But yes, now it is used, I think, as a prison and a staging ground for trucks. So you are right. And then when you look, like the big thing for me is when you look at the world game right now, Argentina's falling behind.
Yeah.
And they won Copa America. That's great. But when you look at the top players being produced, and let's say the top 5 leagues in Europe, almost every country outside of those outside of those 5 countries, has increased the amount of players they are putting into those leagues. But so where does the numbers come from, though, right? Because someone has to drop down for everyone to come up. Almost all of that is Argentina losing ground. So when you look at the top 5 leagues, it used to be local players and then a ton of Argentine, Brazilian, and a few other exports. Now there's more Danish and Swedish and South Korean and Colombian players in these leagues than ever before. And the decrease has been in Argentina. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of it is infrastructure. And so if you can use a moment like this to sort of reset things, as long as you don't make it a situation where Argentina has to pay up front for all of it, and then it ruins everything else that they could spend money on, I think you have an opportunity to have lasting change in that region.
Well, that's one of the reasons why, I don't want to get to the negatives. And by the way, actually, before we get to the negatives, technically, if you want to get back on the cycle, this would be getting back on the cycle. And this is why It was an early favorite. Andrew Warshaw and Inside World Football said, back in March that this was a early favorite to land the tournament. If you look at the cycle, in theory, you have South America in 2014 in Brazil, Europe in 2018 with Russia, Asia, Qatar 2022, North America 2026. It's a perfect, it slots in right there, 2020, 2030. I mean, the negatives, security issues. I'm not a security expert. I'm not going to say these places aren't safe, but many people might say that, compared to some other places, there might be certain security issues there. We mentioned infrastructure. How much, public money can they use on this? I mean, Argentinians, the value of the currency there has skyrocketed in recent years, and I know they've had some major economic issues in that country. Chile's had massive upheaval recently. We did an episode on Football Today about their massive, political upheaval there. I don't know the situations in Uruguay and Paraguay, but those are some of the stumbling blocks that they might encounter. And I don't even know what other ones, to say nothing of the fact that if this is open to 211 host countries, there's only 12, or I don't know how many countries in the South American bloc.
There's 12 in CONMEBOL.
Yeah. You like to think that they might get some more from Latin America and North American support, but they're missing a huge block when it comes to these political, because at the end of it is politics. We can say whatever we want, but it's politics. That being said, I did want to say, FIFA really is a marketing company. That's what they are. They're an event organizer and they're a marketing company. And this is probably one of, if not the easiest to market, for the Centenario reason, for we're bringing football back to the, passion powerhouse of the world, which is Argentina. I think selling this is a little bit easier than selling some of the other ones on the list, in my opinion. And FIFA is a marketing machine. That's what they're supposed to do. That's what they specialize in theory in doing.
Yeah, I mean, think about people around the world. You go into that World Cup talking about Maradona and Messi, and you talk about, I think it's pretty well understood, at least in the football world, but not hard to explain outside. Pound for pound, Uruguay is the best football nation on the planet, right? It's a country of 4 million people that has not just won 2 World Cups and the Olympics, which at the time were those World Championship back before the 1950s, but continues to be now again one of the powers in the world's game for the size of their country. And I think it's easy to explain the passion and the energy there. Obviously, the Chile teams that we've watched, that Bielsa started, and under him, I think there's a level of excitement about what they've done around the world. And Paraguay at their peak from the mid-1990s all the way through to 2010 was a continual round of 16 contender.
And Cruz, so, man.
Exactly, Nelson Valdez. So you look at, for sure, Argentina and Uruguay, I think will be the lead of that marketing, of that excitement, of that energy globally and also of those bids. But I think you look at 4 countries that, because remember, and we haven't said this yet, this will be a 48 team World Cup, guaranteed, because it will be expanded in 2026. It could expand more by the time we get to the 2030 World Cup. And so you need a ton of space. You need, I think, individual pods and areas to host these things. And so it's not ridiculous to think that 4 countries would be needed for that, but also that 4 countries could do that well, being able to kind of control their own little part of it and create their own culture and energy around that.
You would have to just make South American qualifying. Like, could you imagine it's like,
You wouldn't even have.
yeah, you just have to like give like 2 or 3 spots after that, if that. All right, let's move on. Actually, very quickly, Dave, 20 seconds. Why do you think it won't go there if it doesn't?
You won't get enough votes because, as you said, the South American bloc isn't that large that they already control guaranteed a number of votes. And I don't think you'll have the public support because you won't have the public money.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. All right, next one. And this is like kind of, I would say is the other really big primo bid that's going to go in. That's going to be formidable. And that is Spain and Portugal. Potentially, who knows, maybe with Morocco will join that down the road. But those are the 2 headliners and the 2 ones we know at the moment that are making that bid. Just a little bit of background. Spain last hosted the World Cup in 1982. Obviously, Portugal has never hosted the World Cup. Both of them have hosted the the Euros, which Spain did in 1964, and Portugal did more recently in 2004. And both of them bid for the 2018 and 2022 World Cup and came up short there. So that's kind of just a brief little background. And they announced their bid much more recently than the previous one we just mentioned. And they launched it kind of officially back in October of 2020. Dave, Spain, Portugal, 2 countries you love, I love. Why should it be there? Or why shouldn't it be there?
So I think the should is fairly simple. It's a region of the world where World Cups that have been hosted there in Germany and France over the last 30, 40 years have been wildly successful. There are a lot of big time nations that obviously come from the Western European area as well as North Africa. And so you have the potential for some great fan support coming in, and as well as a ton of people traveling and wanting to be a part of it, which again starts to boost your revenue and make it more attractive. You're looking at 2 countries as well that are historic football nations. Portugal more recently in that way, but it's a country that you associate with the game always, and Eusebio and Porto and all that history. And then you look at 2 places where they'll probably use most of the infrastructure going forward, and can probably put together a really attractive tournament, and one that I think people will come for. And I can say this as someone who traveled to Brazil, Canada, and Russia for World Cups. I didn't really want to go to Russia. And then I have no interest in going to Qatar now. I think people around the world will, the idea of going to a World Cup in Madrid, in Barcelona, in Lisbon, that's attractive to them. And so I think that there'll be a ton of excitement around that for that tournament.
Yeah. And of all the places, like, unlike Argentina and Uruguay and Chile, this one is a lot easier to get to. Not only do you have all of Europe and North Africa, as you mentioned, and, the Middle East, but, there are a bunch of flights from Brazil to Portugal. Like, that's a well-traveled route. So you can have South American countries visit, and there's a huge connection, I know, as someone who used to live in Madrid, between Ecuador and Spain, and there are a lot of connections between obviously Spain and South America. This is not like brand new knowledge, but it's worth mentioning.
When you say connections, you mean colonialism? Is that the word we're using?
I mean, that's
just a different C word. I didn't know which one we were on.
No, but colonialism, but there's still like ties to that today, whether rightly, wrongly, but there are big sections of people from Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Spain. And if you're a you know person from South America and your team's in that World Cup, you're going to be a lot more likely to go if you're like, hey, I speak the language, like let's go there. I think why not? So there's a lot going for it. And commercial deals, because it's in Europe, and there'll be a lot of big European companies that are interested in it. So I think there are a lot of reasons why you'd want to do it there. And you mentioned the venues, and they don't have to do much. Portugal already has a couple great big stadiums. Spain, because of their history, they have a bunch of really big stadiums, in Sevilla and Madrid. I mean, just alone, I can think of, the new camp, the Wanda, the Bernabeu, in Lisbon, the Stadio of Light. Like, you have so many good stadiums already.
So can I just push back slightly, which is in Portugal, you have 3 stadiums over 40,000 capacity.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the frustration to me with what we're talking about. And I'll be curious to see how this number shifts. But Braga, right, one of those stadiums that we all want to go to.
Yeah.
We've all seen pictures of, we've all watched games there, hosted the European Championships in 2004. It's a 30,000 person stadium. So under FIFA's requirements, it could not host games. And for Portugal, it's the 2 stadiums in Lisbon and then the one in Porto. Everything else is 37,000 and smaller. And I think that's a little frustrating. I also believe, actually, there's a national stadium in Lisbon, which holds like 120,000 if you want to. But again, that's 2 cities. And so I think 40,000, I understand the need there. But I actually think when you talk about environment and the game being a television event now, you have to look at the revenue you're getting for those tickets, the extra 10,000 tickets or 8,000 tickets, versus hosting a World Cup game at that Braga stadium and having everyone around the world watch it on TV and then sell that commercial advertising and all of that. So I just wanted to push back there a little bit. Obviously, in Spain, you have 6 or 7, as you said, that are already 40,000 and above, and you have.
I mean, I think even more than that. I mean, you have in Bilbao, you have the Anoeta and Sociedad, you have in Sevilla, you have 2 cities, 2 stadiums.
Yeah, I count 8. Based off what they announce as their capacity.
Yeah.
And then the other big one for Spain, which is unique, I think, to all of this, is that big opening and closing match. You need the 80,000 plus. They obviously have Camp Nou and the Bernabeu, so they wouldn't have to do
and I think
anything
the Wanda,
for those games, which is rare.
But as you said, I'm not saying that they wouldn't need any infrastructure add if you mentioned Braga, but like it wouldn't take a big effort to kind of upgrade the facilities in these places to make it World Cup ready. So I think there's a lot going for it. I mean, any reasons why it won't? I mean, I think the only reason like it won't is just because there'll be another better bid, not because like anything will be wrong with their bid. Because I can't see any obvious negatives.
Yeah, I think I go back to like in Portugal, it's really 2 cities. So you look at the amount of cities that can host, again, a 48-team tournament, different than what we've seen in the past. So a need for more cities to be able to handle this type of thing. And so I wonder if there's enough there, which is why I think the Morocco part's really interesting. And we can talk about that later, but to me, that's the home run in all of this. So I think there's that. And then there's Spain was quietly talking about bidding for the 2026 World Cup. There wasn't a ton of support globally. And I think that's where you come back to having countries that have been affected by these countries in the past having to support them. And so, as you said, it's a political game. It's at times a popularity game. And I don't know that there's a ton of global support in all 211 federations, if that's the way the voting breaks down, for 2 Western European nations that have had some negative effect on a lot of those countries.
Yeah, and it should be noted that UEFA president Alexander Seferin said that he's really going to lobby all of UEFA to kind of rally behind one bid.
Yeah.
And I think this is the likely one bid from UEFA. We'll talk about
really,
it.
Mate?
Uh-huh.
Mate, you think that's the one bid?
Oh, you think it's going to be? You think it's going to be UK Ireland? UK and Ireland?
I don't know, dude. I think it might be coming home.
It might be coming home. You think? Should I?
This
should I
one
tell
would
my
actually be
neighbors?
accurate.
Yeah.
Casper Schmeichel couldn't be upset about this one because it actually has happened before
Um,
in the UK, so it would be coming home.
yeah. I mean, so kind of the background about this one is that, they bid for the 2018 World Cup, and that bid kind of blew up in their face. David Beckham couldn't really get it done when it mattered most, nor could Prince William. Um, yeah, just didn't happen. 2018 World Cup. It was a shame, but they got the Euros this year, essentially, as while it was in many different places. Like it was put, the final rounds were in England, and yeah. So in my opinion, they kind of already got a major tournament this year. Uh, but we'll see if they get the 2030. Let's kind of talk about why it might or might not happen, because I think there are just as many reasons why it won't happen as it will happen. And let's get into those now.
So the reason both they should or they would is because one, people see it as the historic home of the game, and people around the world associate the sport with England and the UK in general. There is a obviously massive worldwide fan base to English Premier League teams, which for a lot of people ends up being support for those places, right? So, for example, you're an American, Josh. Where do you live?
Liverpool, the Republic of Liverpool.
And who are you a fan of since you were
Liverpool.
a child growing up in the United States? There are a ton of people like that. And so there are people who know a lot about these cities and these places and have a connection to these places. And it's not hard for them to rally the energy to vote or to have public support to voting for them. The second big reason is there's a large level of infrastructure already built. We talked about the stadiums in Spain. I didn't have a quick count, but I think there's over 14 or 15 that are plus 40K. And then you obviously have Wembley, which is 90,000 plus if you want it to be. And then you'd probably, if you didn't want to do both the open and the close there, you'd start to have to tweak Old Trafford a little bit. But I'm sure that FIFA would get around 3,000 less people to put a game at Old Trafford, one of the big World Cup games at Old Trafford. So you have that. You have a level of work across different countries, even if it is Ireland and Scotland and England and Wales that are pretty closely associated. There is still that sharing and that idea of co-hosting across different countries. So I think there's a romantic side to it, and there's a plausibility side to it, and so there's a lot going for it. A lot of that was hurt by a bunch of fans running into the European Championship final without a ticket, and I think all of that showed most of the negative cliches of the English fans and the English football experience to the world, and probably at a really bad time in a really public way. But I think, as I laid out, there's a decent level of support for a moment like this.
Yeah, I think had the Euros not happened, they would have stood a decent chance. But after what happened at the final, with the fans rushing the stadium, and the fear of a potential crush, one of the things, and they mentioned this in the Athletic article, was about how, like, the UK was seen as a country that just knew how to put on events without any issues, and now that entire uh, concept has been reimagined as, wait, could they actually pull this off? Like, do we have to worry about hooliganism or families being able to go? I mean, me and you went to Russia, Dave. Did we see a single fight?
No, I don't believe so. But we did see the issues at Euro 2016 from Russia fans, right?
Yeah. But what I'm saying is they knew how to put on a games without any issues, without any you know uh, problems. I mean, I'm not saying that they didn't have their own
Military
issues.
occupying your own people is an interesting way to say they know how to put on an
Yeah.
event. But yes, understood.
Yeah, and I mean, people were calling it was pretty much like a war zone, on Wembley Way. So that's pretty huge. I want to, when you're trying to host a tournament. And I think generally, like, and they mentioned this as well in the Athletic piece, like, Brexit has done a number on their image worldwide, I think, but specifically within Europe. I think a lot of people don't like the English at this moment, and you know don't like Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's pushing this heavily. They have, talked about and set aside 2.8 billion, or sorry, not billion, million pounds in their budget earlier this year just for this. Um, yeah, I just like. I think a lot of people are going to just look at this as kind of a nationalistic bid, even though they are including Ireland. And I think also there is like a bit of jealousy anyway with the Premier League, and people are just going to be like, "Oh, what, you get this too?" So I think there are a lot of reasons that people are not going to be up for this bid. And a lot of it is because of what just happened when they kind of hosted the end of the Euros. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I think a lot of that makes sense. I think we kind of saw that in the last England bid, was like less of the, oh, this is the ancestral home of the game, and more like, really, like England again. And I think a ton of frustration from countries around the world that have a negative view of England. And as you mentioned with Brexit, has a lot of that changed? Or has it actually, I think it may have shifted away and then come back now recently. So yeah, there'll be a bunch of pushback there. The one big conversation I know around the 2018 World Cup was infrastructure on housing for people. These are cities that have massive stadiums. Most of them are fan bases that live in those cities. And so there was a big push. I remember one of the ideas was to use university dorms as temporary World Cup housing for fans, and then convert it back, which is great for the idea of sustainability. But now you're talking about, again, a 48-team World Cup, expanding it even more. And while you do have the ability to add a Dublin and a Cardiff and Edinburgh and all those cities, do you have the infrastructure in Sunderland and Newcastle to put up enough fans and have them there? If not, then you're still talking about needing to build for it. This isn't something that's turnkey, where it would just be ready to go. I don't know that there's a country in the world, really, outside of maybe the US, that could just host a World Cup tomorrow. Maybe Germany as well, because they did it in 2006. And a lot of that still exists. Those are probably the two. While I think there's an assumption from people that England's one of those countries, where it's like, well, the Premier League's here. Like, we could just drop it here and it could go. And I don't think that's the case, because of all of that goes around it, besides just the capacity of the stadiums. So that there still would be work to do. But I think the public perception and then, the popularity voting in all of this are the major pushbacks, unless England can really sell it's coming home, this is where the game was found, this would be a beautiful way, to celebrate 100 years of a World Cup.
yeah.
Which, by the way, they weren't at the first four because they refused to be a part of the global game.
So, I mean, it would be a bit ironic if the 100th anniversary was in England. But let's move on to the final likely Euro bid: Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, Serbia. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this? I mean, it seems kind of crazy that they, actually think they might win. Honestly, I put in my notes, it seems to me that they're like, we want to bid for Euro 2028, and we might as well just bid for the 2030 World Cup and then just throw it together. But it seems like a better bid for the Euros in 2028. Any thoughts on this?
I think going back to the first thing, I bet you a lot of these bids fall out before we even get to 2024. And so I think that's part of why not put your hat in if you're actually willing to host it. Again, I think you're right with the Euros of okay, you can generate a little extra buzz with this and then scale back to saying, okay, we'd be happy. You go into a meeting with other people in UEFA and you tell Spain and Portugal and you tell the UK, okay, fine, we're happy to take out our bid if you support our Euro bid, right? So it gives you some more chips on the table. And I think there's an interest. Again, I've said, I think these have to be co-hosted. I don't think one country has the infrastructure to do any of this because of the size that it's becoming and because of the needs. And so I think it's an interesting idea that you could push of, well, this is how a regional tournament could work. We could do it the right way and kind of build a roadmap for other people. I think South Korea and Japan started that. And now we're kind of getting to, with the United North American bid, the next stage of this. And so these four countries where they don't have a ton of history of working together well, could show that this could work, and that could be another way to kind of make this a World Cup where it matters more than just the game. It's how can we help countries use the sport to bring countries closer together. Yeah. That would be my bid. Those would be my two top sentences if I was working for this bid committee, which if they want to bring me on board, I'd live on the Greek coast and just, work consultant work or whatever it is they need. But
why not?
They have my number.
I mean, listen, I would totally be sold on this for Euros, not really for World Cup, but it's an interesting bid to say the least. Let's move down because we still got a couple more, which is crazy. So many more. We're gonna have to try to cut this down time wise. But the next one that we kind of mentioned in that they did in the Athletic, which is the Saudi Arabia Italy World Cup that they're exploring. I mean, obviously this isn't an official bid. This hasn't been. This is all just kind of reported in this Athletic story by Matt Slater. Why might it happen? The two countries already enjoy close business, diplomatic, and sporting relations. The Italian Super Cup was or will be, in Saudi Arabia coming up in January, where they've also had it in the last couple of years. Saudi Arabia is starting their own version of BN Sports because they're tired of stealing. No, I'm joking. The Qatar's, and as part of that package, according to Matt Slater, they're gonna make Serie A rights kind of the big ticket item, probably because they love Ronaldo. And as we know, Saudi Arabia is trying to make themselves a kind of a sport destination. They've hosted a bunch of heavyweight fights. We mentioned the Italian Super Cup. They've had a bunch of international teams like Argentina and Brazil go there. And I think even the Spanish Super Cup, they were trying to get to go there. And they're just trying to make that happen, to say nothing of, they've been, politicking behind the scenes with the Nations League and the expanded Club World Cup. So there's a lot of reasons why Saudi Arabia, to say nothing of the sports washing, would be interested. And Italy, I mean, the reason Slater posits that they're looking into it is because they could get Saudi Arabian money to pay for their upgrade in stadiums, which is, interesting to say the least. So what do you want to jump off there, Dave?
I think geographically and setup wise, it makes zero sense. On paper, it makes 100% sense. It's a country in Saudi Arabia that's trying to grow their global profile. As you've said, bring all these events. They're trying to show that they're more than just oil, that there's entertainment, that there's things you can do there. And Italy basically, no offense, but as a country is just selling their past culture and history at this point in all industries, not just in using football.
Fighting words, Dave. They just won the 100-meter.
True.
That's progressive.
And the Eurovision and the European Championships and the high jump. So they are, you're right. It is a country of greatness right now. So I think all of that makes sense. Like Italy, again, doesn't have the infrastructure or the money to put together their own World Cup bid. They could try and co-host with other countries. It's a little tough right now because France just hosted. So you would assume they're out. And then you start talking Germany probably out as well. So now you're talking about Austria and Switzerland. Maybe there's not enough stadiums to get it done. And so this makes sense to me on paper. It's just, one, I think most people will look at it as odd and don't want it to happen. My understanding is there's 2 cities in Saudi Arabia that are over 1 million people in population. Mecca and Medina are, but I don't think they'd be allowed to host a World Cup. I don't even think most people are allowed to go there casually. I think you really only can for Hajj. So there's not a ton of infrastructure there for Saudi Arabia. And I think coming off the experience, the world watching Qatar build out this World Cup, I think there would be a lot of pushback there on top of just the nature of people hearing Saudi Arabia and Italy and how do you get between the two, and how do you travel? And I think a lot of that's overrated. Like, I took 900 flights to get around Brazil. We went to Russia. We didn't leave one corner of the country. And there were games 8 hours away via train in Moscow, which is the closest city, and then however much further away into the east of the country. So I think the idea of flying between games and distance is a bit Western European central. Like, it takes me more time to get from New York to Miami than it does to get from London to half of Europe. And so I don't see a huge problem with that. But I think mentally for people, it'll be hard to wrap their head around.
I mean, Dave, the way you get there is by private jet, right?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, as you said, like, I think the biggest reason is after the Qatar World Cup in 2022, they're not going to just want to stick it back in the Middle East and what appears to be and face the same issues they face with Qatar. They need to, let it breathe, so to speak, and come back in, the 38 World Cup or something. So yeah, I don't think this is really a serious bid. I think the Boston Consulting Group is just trying to get some money out of the Saudis. Let's go back. We got two more to go. There are that many people interested. Morocco. So Morocco could be with Morocco, Egypt, could be Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. Morocco, they are the perennial applicant. They just love applying. Maybe they're just, masochists, but they just love doing it. That being said, a lot of reasons why they could be interesting. But so they applied for it for the 2026 bid, 2010, 2006, 1998, 1994. So they've applied for like more than half of the World Cups since 1994.
They know where the drop box is. they are comfortable dropping off the bid. They are experts in that part for sure.
Yeah, just like a little bit of background. So like, Dave, before we get into any bids, like, which do you think makes more sense? Morocco, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, or could it be like just make it the whole MENA region? Could just like do Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, all together, and Saudi Arabia. Why not? Like, just make it the whole thing.
Again, I don't hate that idea because, as I've said, you need to co-host with a bunch of different countries, I think, to build the cities and build the infrastructure. It's fascinating, actually, to read about and look at why Morocco has bid so many times. Because when we talked about emerging nations wanting to use these events to kind of show their standing, for Russia, it was an Olympics and a World Cup. But they applied for everything. Morocco, outside of, I think, hosting one track and field world championship, it has only been about football. They've hosted a Club World Cup, they've hosted AFCON, and they, as we've said, continually bid for the World Cup. They have not bid for any Olympics.
I'm still not over the fact that we were supposed to go to the AFCON in Morocco and it fell through because of freaking Ebola.
We are the real victims of Ebola, Josh. I'm glad you could lay that out for everyone.
People needed to know.
But so there's so much passion there for the game. And I think one of the big things that FIFA highlighted when they did the bids for 2026 and they put together the reports was the government being very helpful with trying to get this bid done. And they actually said that I can actually read it for you. The description of the two bids is: the Morocco 2026 bid and United 2026 bid represent two almost opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to the nature of their bids. The Morocco bid is well presented and strong in terms of government commitment, but would need to newly build most of its tournament-related and wider infrastructure. The United 2026 bid, on the other hand, has promising level of infrastructure already in place and is fully operational. They then leave out the rest of it, which is, well, if you're calling them opposite and you're saying the level of commitment and excitement from Morocco is what's opposite, there was a lack of that, I think, for the United North American bid. So that's where FIFA feels about it, and I think you can kind of get that externally. We were at the Morocco-Iran World Cup game to open up. I think we both say it was one of the best atmospheres we've ever been in.
Yeah.
And that goes to a lot of the Morocco fans. Algeria and Tunisia are bordering countries. And so that's three countries along the Mediterranean, along the Atlantic, that all have great football histories. So it's not one of those. I think there is still a place for people's mind, like, oh, Qatar, well, they shouldn't be in the tournament. Should they really host the tournament? I think people still have a level of that. These are three countries where you wouldn't have that issue. You know there's a support for the game. You can spread out your facilities amongst them, and you can organize travel amongst them. And so I think it's really interesting. And all the things you said about Western Europe, or I did about travel there, about time zones, about TV, all that stuff, it applies here as well, because this is basically the exact same place. So I think of the two bids you just said, that's the one that makes more sense. And that's a little bit of the background of the energy behind the Morocco bid, which I think gives them a slight advantage over other bids, because I think people out there feel like they do deserve an opportunity. To me, it should be Morocco, Spain, and Portugal. And I said Korea and Japan sort of reset how you could host a World Cup. And FIFA was basically looking, how can we get this to Asia? And one country didn't make sense. And so the two of them worked together, two countries that have an incredible rivalry over their history and a level of hatred as well, both on the sports field but outside, and mainly in military conflicts, that work together to host that World Cup. Well, what's next? I think what's next is a cross-regional tournament.
Cross-continental, Dave. Cross-continental.
Exactly. So you look at a country from CAF and from Africa, and two countries from Europe. Of course, the travel is not an issue. You can take a boat between them. You can drive between them. You can take so that's not a problem. It's regionalized. You would be able to spread out the cities and the tournament as well. You have probably 3 cities in Morocco that are really ready to host something like this. And the rumor is they would build a 90,000 person stadium in Casablanca. That would be their big major stadium for beginning and end. And I still think Portugal and Spain probably need a little bit of help to host a tournament like this.
And it could get you the African votes as well. I mean, I don't want to block them together, or anything, because I don't know enough about the politics of African football, because I know that's like heavily, segmented. But
you still put yourself in a place where now you've got a ton of support from UEFA if you are the lone bid out of UEFA, and then you have at least a bid to appeal to at least North Africa, if not countries across all of Africa. And so I think all of that makes a ton of sense to me. And I actually think if the three of them could come together and show that they could be cohesive in their bid, it's probably the winning bid in my mind.
It's a pretty great bid. I mean, it really would be. And great for Morocco after like failing, so many times to get it. And I think also like in general, like, it's good to like get back, a country from Africa. Like I hope we get many more African bids in the future, but like, I think it's good after 2010 to get back on the continent. And also like, I do think it adds a different flavor. And, people like, might have rolled their eyes when like you said that Iran, Morocco was like one of the best atmospheres. Like of the World Cup we went to, like I'd say that and like the Argentina game was probably the two best atmospheres that we went to. Those fans were going crazy.
Mexico as well.
And Mexico, Germany, yeah. But like those fans in those games in Morocco will be crazy and so much fun to go to. And I mean, I really hope, if we got the World Cup in Morocco, Spain, and Portugal, or the Argentina, Uruguay one, I would be happy with either of those two bids. Because that would be pretty unbelievable. I just don't think it really makes sense when Morocco, Egypt, or Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria. I just think they're not ready for that, personally. But I think Morocco is to be part of a bigger bid. Oh God, that would be so much fun. Could you imagine?
Yeah, I think that's the dream scenario.
Yeah, and now it's finally time to get to the final bid. Although this is more rumor and just like we'll see if it ever comes to fruition. The question is not the question is not if it comes, it's just when it comes. And that is with China, the big sleeping giant in the World Cup bidding process, because I think it's pretty commonly like thought and known that they will get one. The question is when. They've been rumored to be more interested and be the more likely spot for 2034. As I mentioned, FIFA doesn't like to give, with their rotating. If Qatar gets it in 20 or has it in 2022, they don't want it to go to an Asian country in 2030. That being said, I mentioned at the top that Gianni Infantino, didn't dismiss it being in Asia, and they have like an insane amount of reasons of why it might happen there. I mean, stadiums alone, they're building billion-dollar stadiums, like they're just planting trees. Specifically, Guangzhou in Guangzhou Evergrande Grande, they built $1.7 billion stadium with a capacity of 100,000. They're in the middle of building that, and that's supposed to like kind of rival Barca's new camp, and it should be completed by the end of next year, or who knows, maybe a little bit later. That Evergrande group is building plenty more of properties and at least two other 80,000 seater stadiums. So they'll be chock full of stadiums that can host these big games. And I mean, there's just so many reasons, Dave. Like, I could go down a list. Like, they're already going to be hosting the expanded Club World Cup, you know, like their Xi Jinping, their president, is tight with Infantino, and they've talked and met a bunch of times since 2017. And I think the other obvious big reason is in the 2018 World Cup, as I've mentioned on this podcast before, 7 of the 19 giant corporate sponsors were Chinese. Like, this is easily the biggest commercial World Cup, even potentially bigger than the US, Canada, Mexico World Cup that you could have. And it's probably the only country in the world besides like the US and, as you said, Germany, that could host it by itself. I mean, there's even more reasons, but like, I don't know, Dave, what do you think?
I agree with everything you said. I think it's all completely accurate. There's a desire for FIFA to like open up China to really be a football nation because of just the pure numbers that you can put together. And that has been part of the push with the World Cups. That was why Japan hosted. That's why the United States hosted, was to kind of establish the game in those regions and generate a level of energy around it. And I think China, that makes every bit of sense. Plus, as you said, they have the population to host it. They have a ton of the infrastructure already to host it. They'd probably have to put together stuff around the stadiums, but that's, as we said, every country is going to have to do something to finish off the bid. It just seems like for China, why fight for 2030 when that's something a lot of people want, and not focus on 2034 and kind of guarantee yourself that opportunity to be the host?
So I'll mention why they might go for 2030. Let me make the case. I think the biggest reason is twofold. One, it's a 4-year head start on making your team good and like getting people involved, and getting excitement in the country and not waiting.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest reason, in my opinion, and I do think they will go for 2034, so I'm not suggesting that they will go for 2030, but is Xi Jinping is 68 years old at the time of recording. And people know they don't live forever, and he's like, by the time 2030 comes around, he's going to be 77 years old. Is he going to want to risk waiting another 4 years till he's 81? And who knows what the case is, and he might not even be president then. And like, I just think he's going to want to be the president when this happens. And you're really pushing it 13 years when he's 81 years old. He still might be, but I think he's going to want to be president, and he's going to be like, I'm the guy who brought it here. And we forget how like egomaniacal sometimes, not we forget, we totally know how egomaniacal these guys are and how much they care about their legacy and their accomplishments. And I just wouldn't be surprised if he was like, fuck it, let's just do it in 2030. We'll still win this. We still know that FIFA wants it here. We still know that I'm close with Gianni Infantino, and we can make it happen. Why not 2030? And especially with of this like infrastructure being built now, they're like, are we going to want to wait 10 years to unveil this stuff on the international stage? I mean, Club World Cup's all good, but like, the best is the World Cup. So those are all the reasons why I think like there's a good chance that it still might be 2030, even though if you put a gun to my head, I'd say 2034.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And Xi Jinping is a lot of the force behind growing the game in that country, and his interest in the sport and his desire. And then you mentioned the connection now that he has personally with Gianni Infantino. I think that makes a ton of sense. There's a lot going on with the China bid. One thing is their soft sports power is pretty influential. I can say here in the region that the U.S. plays in, where I live, multiple teams host their home national team games in stadiums that China built for them. That's the case across Africa as well. And so they have their fingers in a lot of FAs already to start to generate votes. And that's not including maybe them getting the full force of Asia behind them, which is, I think, the biggest by number of countries. Maybe it's just behind
I think it's
Africa,
just behind Africa, yeah.
Right, of confederations. And then you look at, okay, for Oceania, does it make a ton of sense? Australia's part of the Asian Confederation. Can they help you drum up support in that area as well? So it all makes sense with China. I think we're both saying it's going to happen. The question if it's 2030 or not.
The question is, do they want it in 2030 or 2034? Because it will be whatever they want. Like to me, if they went to Gianni Infantino tomorrow and said, listen, we want to make this happen for 2030, they're going to get it, as you said, with the soft money and the relationships they've built around the world. And like, I bet there's already a wink deal between, Infantino and China and Xi Jinping. So to me, it's really a matter of when they want. And they might actually want to wait to 2034, just if anything, to have a better team and, to be able to do well. But we'll see. David, it sounds like your dream scenario is the Portugal, Spain, Morocco. Am I right?
No, I think the South America one, I'm just as excited about. I think that one makes the most political sense in terms of like winning, plus one that I would be excited to see happen.
I
think either of them. Yeah, I think either of them for me, I'd be excited about. I think they make sense. I think they can help their regions. We've reached a point now where it feels like World Cups and Olympics are like, I guess I would call it guilty pleasure because they are so detrimental a lot of times to the countries that are hosting them, to the environment, to everything that's happening. I mean, with Tokyo, it's even worse now with COVID, and the European Championships as well. But I think that there are ways to do those right. And if you do that, they could be positives for those regions and maybe even for the world. Plus, you would get really great games in really fantastic atmospheres.
Yeah, I hope it's the South American one in Argentina and Uruguay and those countries, because for no other reason of like, if they can't get it then, I don't know when they're going to get it next. Like, it might honestly be like decades until they get another bid because of, we mentioned with the political, votes and stuff, but also because there are just so many other countries, around the world that want to get one before South America and have more money to throw at it and kind of bigger selling points. And the best one for South America at this point is history. And if you take that away, man, like, I don't know when they're going to get it. Like, so, I mean, in a perfect scenario, they would get it 2030. China gets theirs in 2034. And then in 2038, we get that Spain, Portugal, Morocco. But that's just my dream world. And probably it almost never happens as you want it. So it'll probably not be South America, but we'll see. We'll see. God, this was a really interesting episode, Dave. We'll be talking about.
It's fun when you have a couple $1 billion to toss around. It makes the imagination really start to roll.
I imagine next time we'll be talking transfers or previews or something. But it was fun to do this before we get back into the club game. This is probably the last international pod we'll do for a little bit. So thanks for taking the time as always. Oh yeah, and subscribe if you haven't. The music for this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about the music in the episode show notes.